Well, good morning, everyone, in person and online. We've heard that several people have already tuned into the live stream from various parts of the world. We had RSVPs from people in Brazil, South Africa, Ireland, the UK, the US, and in Canada. People in the Southern Hemisphere get a bit of a reprieve in certain parts of the world, Australia and New Zealand in particular, because I think it's about 2 o'clock in the morning there, so I'll let them off the hook. But welcome. My name's Tim Fletcher. I'm a faculty member here at Brock University, which is in St. Catharines in Ontario in Canada, about a hefty 9 iron from Niagara Falls. So if you're tuning in to us from somewhere else in the world, that's where this is coming from. The symposium's title today is Getting Started with Self-Study. My colleague, Dr. Déirdre Ní Chróinín from Mary Immaculate College in Ireland, she and I have been collaborating on a self-study now for the past 2 years. Déirdre is visiting Brock after we presented some of our findings at the American Educational Research Association conference in Chicago recently. And to coincide with her visit, we thought that it would be a really nice idea to try and both introduce people who are new to self-study or who are looking to take their self-study research a little bit further, because through our collaboration we've both learned about self-study but probably had more questions arise through the process than answers. We have people asking questions who have sent in questions which coincided with a lot of the questions that we have as well. The main purpose of the symposium is to introduce teacher researchers, and we use that term very broadly, practitioner researchers, from across various fields to self-study methodology, and to provide you with an accessible entry point into the how-to of self-study. There are probably some people who will access this at some point or another who are familiar with self-study, but we're hoping that everyone can at least find something learn something from today's symposium. We're very lucky and honoured to have some keynote speakers contributing today. We have Professor Clare Kosnik from the University of Toronto, Professor Julian Kitchen from Brock University, and Professor Tom Russell, who can't make it in person but who has sent along a video in advance. These three people are leaders in self-study and who have done a lot to advance the field, the methodology, whatever you might, however you might describe it. And so we're very lucky to have them here today. So we thank the keynote speakers for their efforts to be here, whether in person or in spirit. Before we get too far along, I've got several people that I'd like to thank who have been able to make today possible. The Office of Research Services here at Brock University. So for those people who are working in self-study, yes, it is possible to get some funding for self-study research. So thank you very much to Brock's Office of Research Services, who support this symposium through an institutional grant. I'd also like to thank the Irish Research Council and through their New Foundations grant, and Mary Immaculate College for their networking grant, who have enabled Déirdre to make it here from Ireland. I'd also like to thank very much John Winterbottom, who has provided technical support and has set up the live stream that you may be watching this on in the World Wide Web. We've got several hosts of listservs who have distributed the information about this symposium, which has enabled that invitation to get around the world. There are too many people who have helped that to name, but I thank those people as well. I'll also thank Sean Bullock in advance for agreeing to host the archive of this version on the Self-Study Special Interest Group's website, which will make this accessible for, I hope, many years to come. So thank you to Sean, and also, of course, to our speakers again. Just a reminder for the modest crowd that we have here today. Please just be aware that this is being live streamed across the internet, so your image, if you come up into this field, someone may push you away, but your image may appear on the camera and head around the web. Your voice may also appear And also just ask you in advance, please make sure that your phones are turned off, and that's a reminder to myself as well. So to get on with just a very quick introduction to self-study, you may be wondering why I have a picture of a dog to begin this presentation. Actually, there's a couple of dogs who make guest appearances, as you'll see later on in the slideshow. This is a very certain type of dog that I've selected the image of here. Oh, that's not a dog. Robert Below and Stephanie Pinniger described several years ago self-study as a mongrel, meaning that it was a mix of a host of various methodologies that people draw from, are inspired by, or use to guide their work in self-study research. Very briefly, self-study is an interpretive methodology drawing from, among others, the main sources: autoethnographic, narrative, and action research traditions. We'd like to think, though, that self-study becomes the whole that's greater than the sum of the parts of those different methodological traditions. Self-study, in very simple terms and in my very simplistic conceptualization of it, overlaps but's distinguishable from its two closest methodological cousins, if you like, action research and autoethnography. The way that I like to distinguish it, and others may think differently about this, action research has an explicit focus on the practice that the person's engaged with, but at the same time there is not necessarily a focus on the self, the person that is conducting that practice, or those practices, while autoethnography has an explicit focus on the person, the self conducting something, investigating some phenomenon, but there's not necessarily a focus on practice. Self-studies, though, bring those two things together. There is, at all times, an explicit focus on the self in practice. For that reason, it gives voice to the person conducting those practices, and it is, in its very nature, emotional and personal, while also providing some practical explanations or understandings of things. There have been many critics of self-study over the years, and there continue to be. One of the main criticisms levelled at self-study is that it is little more than navel-gazing. However, there has been a lot of writing done that explains how self-study is much more than, and also needs to be, much more than navel-gazing. Self-study acknowledges that the beliefs, values, knowledge, and experiences of the practitioners who are engaged in the practice being researched are often best placed to comment on, critique, and provide insight into the complexity and problematic elements of practice. So what that means is that people who try to provide neutral and detached points of view on practice are probably not in the best position to do so. Practice is personal, it is emotional, and those invested in practice are often in the best position to discuss and critique those practices. Some critics, as we've said, have suggested that self-study is navel-gazing. However, we believe that when shared, and that's an important part of self-study, that it has the potential to be transformative not only for the person or people conducting the work, also for their students, and by extension their students, particularly if we're talking about educational practice, and the discourse communities in which that work is shared. One description of self-study that is used quite a lot was made by Ken Zeichner, who is a prolific teacher education researcher in the United States back in 1999. This comment provided some validation to many who worked in the self-study community when this comment was made. He said the birth of the self-study and teacher education movement around 1990 has been probably the single most significant development ever in the field of teacher education research. Since this comment was made, the self-study of teacher education practices research base grew tremendously, and in the first decade of the 2000s, and now that research base continues to grow. One highlight was a 2-volume handbook which was published in before, which we'll see a little bit later on, and the emergence of studying teacher education, which is the Self-Study of Teacher Education Practices Communities Research Journal. And while Zeichner's comment in 1999 provided inspiration for a lot of people working in self-study, he followed up on this several years later with a challenge to the self-study community several years later, saying, although acknowledging the positive professional development impact of self-study on teacher educators, there is a need for more closely connecting the self-studies of teacher educators to the mainstream of teacher education research, so that the voices of practicing teacher educators are incorporated into syntheses of research on particular aspects of teacher education. What Zeichner is pointing out there, that while there was an increase and tremendous value in the individual self-studies that were being conducted by practitioners around the world, there is a need for those people conducting self-study research to make more explicit efforts to connect those individual self-studies to the research field, whether that's in teacher education research or to other self-studies. And that was a challenge that was reiterated just last week by Mandy Berry, who's the co-editor of Studying Teacher Education Journal, the self-study researchers to better ground their work in the existing literature, in particular on self-studies. Zeichner's belief was that if self-study researchers can do this, the potential for their individual research has a greater potential to make broad impacts in terms of policy, research funding, and larger programs of research. Clare Kosnik will pick up on that line of thought in her talk today. Another point that we should think about to avoid navel-gazing is to think about some criteria for quality in self-studies. Now, there have been several people who have put forward positions on quality in self-study. Probably one of the most prominent are those criteria that were recognised by Vicky Lebowski in 2004. She believes that these 5 criteria not need to be used as a checklist, but integrated into a self-study researcher's project, I guess. Those 5 points are that self-studies are self-initiated and self-oriented by the practitioner or practitioners working on the project, that it is improvement aimed, that it is interactive at some stage of the inquiry. So it's not just about the researcher living in their little bubble, and I guess that's where navel-gazing occurs. That interactivity occurs quite often with critical friends, with students, with the literature, and there is some scope, I guess, for the individual researcher to define what interactivity means to them. However, that is a central point. It uses multiple, primarily qualitative data sources, and defines validity as a dynamic process based in trustworthiness. So in that way, self-study researchers rely on the readers of self-study to discern the extent to which the findings resonate with the people in those discourse communities. This is a very, very brief introduction. There are many other descriptions of quality for self-study, particularly I'm thinking of Below and Pinnigar's paper in 2001. And in some of the starting points that I'm just going to show, that so that people in the audience, whether here at Brock or around the world, can become acquainted with some accessible entry points into the self-study literature. The first one that I'd like to recognise is by Anastasia Samaras. This is called Self-Study Teacher Research, and is a wonderful, practical and accessible guide to conducting self-studies. One thing that I particularly like about this book is that it's aimed for teachers working in schools out in the field, but also those people working in higher education, for example, may find a lot of use in that text. Another one here is by Lasson, Gelman and Kosnik, an edited volume, Self-Study Research Methodologies for Teacher Educators, which gives a brief background, but also looks at the different methods, traditions that self-study researchers have used or could use, and how they might best go about doing that. For those who are interested in going a little bit deeper into the philosophical and theoretical perspectives. This book by Stephanie Finnegar and Marilyn Hamilton, Self-Study of Practice as a Genre of Qualitative Research, provides those philosophical and theoretical perspectives, but also offers some very practical points of view on how to get started. The 2-volume handbook from Springer is also replete with wonderful examples and, I guess, different angles on how people have approached self-study of teaching, teacher education practice. This is drawn from a lot of research conducted prior to that time, and I guess precedes the publication of the Study in Teacher Education journal. I know that there's a few physical education people out in the audience. Not shameless, shameful self-promotion here as well. But my colleague Alan Ovens and I also published this co-edited version, Self-Study in Physical Education, Teacher Education, which was one, I guess, collected several people from around the world who are doing self-studies in physical education, teacher education, and that has expanded and had some resonance. One point that I'd like to acknowledge Alan's contribution to this book, and also to my thinking about that. I like to think of self-study as being more than methods or methodologies. And one point that Alan made, that, and that John Locker made and has made prior to that, is that self-study is much more than methods or methodologies. There is a lot about self-study that is reflected by the discourse community that is involved in the self-study of teacher education practices research, but also self-study embodies a disposition or an attitude of the researcher conducting that work, invested in exploring their own practice. And Julian is going to introduce the idea that we could perhaps start a self-study practice community here at Brock University across disciplines and perspectives. I'll finish off very quickly. If you are out there on the World Wide Web and would like to stay connected to this symposium, we're going high-tech here. I don't know how this will go, but if you, I think this is, I'm feeling pretty cool by saying my Twitter handle for this. If you search at Tim Fletcher 12 or use the hashtag #SstepBrock, you can reply to some recent tweets that I've had, or we can keep the conversation going in the next hour or so, but also keep the conversation going well after this symposium. The symposium, the full live stream will be available on the Self-Study of Teacher Education Practices Special Interest Group website after today, which is selfstudysig.wordpress.com, and later on in the Northern Hemisphere's summer, we're also aiming to present a 10 or 12 minute version, condensed version of this, so please feel free to share that. Very briefly, the agenda for today, following me is Julian Kitchen, who's going to be talking about becoming a self-study educator researcher, stories and possibilities. This will be followed by a chance for brief questions for people in the live audience. We have a video from Tom Russell, who's going to give us a brief history of self-study of teacher education practices. He was one of the originators, I suppose, of self-study. This will then be followed by Clare Kosnik, who will be talking about using self-study as part of a broader program of research, and then questions immediately after. We'll then open it up for discussion and conclude before someone kicks me off the stage, I think. I'd like to introduce Julian Kitchen, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Teacher Education, and he's Director of the Tecumseh Centre for Aboriginal Research and Education at Brock University. Importantly for Julian's work in the self-study community, he was recently announced as Chair-elect of the Self-Study of Teacher Education Practice Special Interest Group at the American Educational Research Association. For people who like acronyms, going to be chair-elect of the STEP-SIG at AERA. He recently completed a lengthy term as editor of the Brock Education Journal, which is housed here at Brock University. Julian has published widely in research using self-study methodology, published in top-tier journals and edited books, and it's a pleasure to introduce him here today. And I'd also like to thank Julian for his support of this symposium from the start. So I'll just bring up Julian's slides. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim, for that presentation. And Déirdre as well, for the two of you for organizing this event. I think it's really exciting for the self-study community. I think it's really exciting for universities because there's more that can be done using self-study methodologies beyond teacher education. So I thank you both for that. I guess in terms of my presentation, I begin with an assumption. And it's an assumption that if you're here listening to this, you're being both idealistic and pragmatic. On the one hand, you care deeply about your students, you care deeply about teaching, and you want to make a difference in that regard. On the other hand, you're worried about scholarship. You want to make sure that you get scholarly credit. We all know that promotion and tenure is more dependent on your scholarship than it is on your teaching. And so you want to be able to do that. And often people will say, I can't study my practice because I'm too busy getting my research done. And I remember for me, a seminal comment on that was a line towards the end of an article that Clare Kosnik and Clive Beck wrote from Cohort to Community. And I imagine it was written in response to a reviewer who said, you can't possibly expect us to do this. And what they said was, the best way to be able to do this is to make studying your practice part of your research. And because that's really the only way we can combine it all, because the biggest challenge we all have is not enough time. So if we study our practice or we improve our practice, it may be at the expense of getting a research grant or getting some writing done. So what I'm here to suggest is that you can do both. You can have it all. And one way to do that is through the self-study of your practices. And so I'm going to tell, I said stories and possibilities. So I'm going to tell stories of practice, and so I'm getting a signal from, oh, okay. I'm going to tell stories of practice, and I'm going to share some possibilities that we could work on as well. So in some ways, the stories of practice may sound like, why am I telling you that I've been successful? But the real reason for that is to imagine yourself into that space. So it's one thing to say, oh, you can make self-study a rich part of your career. What I'm going to say is that I did that and it worked for me. And so I tell my story not because my story really matters in any way, but because often if we can put ourselves into someone else's story, that helps us to see ourselves doing something similar. So for me, self-study began, well, mainly as being, the study of education practice has been central to my professional identity for many years, and certainly since 2001. And in 2001, when I was working at the University of Toronto, seconded to their teacher education program, I knew Clare Kosnik, and I was at the mailbox in the curriculum teaching and learning department, and Claire said, oh, you should present at this conference that I'm helping to run at a castle, and she kind of pointed to the sign on the wall saying there was a castle conference in 2002, paper submissions or proposals were due, I guess, the end of September. I said, you know, you essentially do self-study already, you're writing in narrative inquiry, you should really come to this. So having faith in Claire and being someone who tends to seize opportunities, I said, okay. So I submitted a proposal, I got accepted, and I booked a flight. The idea of presenting at some castle in England was quite romantic, so that was definitely part of it. But also the idea of hanging out with a whole bunch of teacher educators who actually cared enough about their practice that they wanted to write about it and inquire about it was deeply intriguing. So stories. In many respects, I was engaged in self-study even before I was aware of SSTEM. In the 1990s, as a graduate student and teacher, I was active in practitioner inquiry, reflective practice, and particularly narrative inquiry. And my thesis work was with Michael Connolly, who's one of the leaders in narrative inquiry. According to a methodology chapter I wrote in the other methodology book that came out at the same time as the one that Tim mentioned, I wrote, narrative inquiry and self-study emerged as responses to the technical rational assumption that research knowledge can be applied to practical problems with little reference to people or context. Drawing on John Dewey's view that educative experiences that lead to growth emerge
when teachers are responsive to the situations in which the interactions take place. Both methods explore ways in which the individual practitioner can make sense of the complexity, uncertainty, instability, uniqueness, and value conflict within a particular professional situation. So my Castle paper in 2002, Becoming a Relational Teacher Educator, a narrative inquirer's self-study, focused on a letter I wrote for teacher candidates in my cohort, outlining my approach to teacher education and my commitment to their personal and professional growth. In the paper, I developed how I lived these values in my practice and the response of teacher education candidates to my approach. The paper was well received and led to me to develop my idea of relational teacher education, which was based on my doctoral work. I developed the notion of relational teacher development and working with teachers in schools, and I did a narrative inquiry on that. And so it led to more work in that area, which ultimately was published in the first 2 issues of the Studying Teacher Education journal. And I just wrote recently a chapter that's coming out this fall, looking back on 15 years of relational teacher education, a narrative self-study. So I kind of reflected on how that approach has informed my work for almost 15 years. When I discovered self-study, I discovered a community of teacher educators who shared my interest in understanding the complexity of teacher education within its practice settings. As importantly, they understood and were committed to developing a community among teacher educators, so not navel-gazing. When I arrived for the dinner at the Castle as a complete outsider, I was immediately made to feel welcome by people at my table. One of them, Stephanie Pinniger, who's one of the authors of the theory book that Tim mentioned, quickly broke down barriers to connect personally and professionally. Stephanie, one of the founders of the STEP SIG, has since played an important role in my professional life as an external reviewer for my dissertation and as editor for a book that series editor for a book I wrote, as a mentor and as a friend. Support groups for new participants were led by senior scholars. So at that one, Fred Korthagen, who's a major theorist in the area, led a small group that included Hafdís Gozhan's daughter and myself. And she's now the chair of the Self-Study Symposium, so he did a pretty good job of mentoring us, I suppose. And the current chair, and Tom Russell, who's presenting by video conference, and John Logren, who was the former editor of the Studying Teacher Education Journal. We're not just these remote figures who only talk to the other elite, like Claire and Clive, but they actually talk to nobodies like me. And there's something about that, because if you've been to conferences, you see the stars hanging out with each other and hanging out with their acolytes. And here they were actually making a point of getting to know people. And that's that sense of community, that sense of valuing. We all shared a commitment to researching practice in order to develop a more effective pedagogy for teacher education. We were pragmatic in our willingness to use a variety of research methods to understand and improve teacher education. And we knew how to have fun, as was evident at meals and in the pub. Self-study's commitment to understanding the intersection of self and other in teacher education drew me in. Its inclusiveness and openness to a range of methodologies made me feel welcome as a narrative researcher, receptive to blending other methods. Most of all, it was the scholarship of the community that kept me engaged. They demonstrated that the study of our practices could count as scholarship, that scholarship did not have to come at the expense of instruction, and that the scholarship and teaching could enrich each other. The existence of the International Handbook of Self-Study of Teacher Education and Teaching and Teacher Education Practices and the Studying Teacher Education Journal reinforced for me that this was a field that was legitimate and scholarly. In short, I remained committed to my students, yet I could also be recognized as a scholar. And the two mattered, especially when I moved to Brock a little bit later as a professor. It was important that in finding time, that I could count both. And indeed, the self-studies played an important role in getting to associate status, professor status quite quickly. And last week I was notified that I was promoted to full professor. And again, most of the work from that, although there's a lot of other, comes from self-study, that I could have made that just on the self-study alone. And that's I say that because if you want to spend time working on your practice and studying your practice, there is a discourse community out there, and you can be part of that and be successful. Over the years, self-study and related approaches to studying practice have formed a substantial strand of my research. For example, a blended self-study and action research study titled Action Research in Teacher Education, Two Teacher Educators Practice Action Research as They Introduce Action Research to Pre-Service Teachers, was published in the major action research journal, Action Research. Another, using written feedback to promote critical reflection, a teacher-educator response to reflective practice by pre-service teachers, was also published in a respected journal, Excelsior, out of New York. Similarly, when I began teaching professionalism and law, which is what I came to Brock to teach, I wrote a piece, Making Education Law Meaningful to Beginning Teachers, a narrative inquiry in Education Journal. When I developed a new Aboriginal education course, I turned to action research infused with self-study for a piece in the Canadian Journal of Action Research. Similarly, when I decided to develop a new workshop on LGBTQ issues, I again took time to both craft a meaningful workshop to develop and it also led to 2 papers in well-regarded journals, Studying Teacher Education and the Alberta Journal of Educational Research. In each case, I received academic credit for my teaching, and through the rigorous cognitive processes of research and writing, enhanced my pedagogy and thus benefited my students. More recently, as a result of my work in self-study, I was invited to write chapters on narrative self-study and collaborative self-study groups for methodology chapters, and a theoretical chapter on incorporating queer theory into self-study. Each of these was an opportunity to work through my thoughts and practices to come to deeper understanding of who I am as a teacher-educator. So it was really great with these. I just got to say, what am I doing? And make explicit what I was doing, and also read up more on the literature, and then tighten my understanding of the methodologies I was using and theoretical frameworks that I was using. I've also edited narrative inquiries into curriculum making and teacher education for Emerald, and an upcoming volume, Self-Study and Social Justice. The editing process, again, contributes to my improving my practice and helps sustain a rich discourse community. As the self-study community has given much to me, I have given back as a reviewer, International Advisory Board member for Studying Teacher Education, and currently, as Tim mentioned, Chair-elect of the SIG. While self-study and related approaches have been central to my work, I have also spread my interest and energies in many ways. I have an extensive publication record in Aboriginal education and a fair number of grants there. I published a textbook on professionalism and law. I'm director of the Aboriginal Center at Brock. I'm program chair for the Department of Teacher Education, and I've been in charge of redesigning a 2-year teacher education program. And then this year I've had the opportunity to write a couple of chapters for handbooks on teacher education. And the good news with that is that it doesn't have to be either or. And even self-study can either be more prominent or take a back seat. So it's taken, other than the theoretical part, it's taken a back seat the last couple of years because I've had a lot of other projects, but then at other times it becomes more forward. So it can be a strand in your research, but it doesn't have to be the only strand. And it can kind of, because mainly self-studies are small in scale, it can ebb and flow as needed. So basically, doing self-study has been really enriching in so many ways for me. And it's not been in place of something else. It's been core, and then it's also allowed me to grow in a lot of other areas. So thinking about that, I then turned to possibilities and raise 6 possibilities. One is ethical review for permission to study your practice. In order to not just navel gaze, it helps to have data. To have data in a university generally requires consent. If you're going to use student data, work by students, comments from students, you need permission from the students, and that needs to be acknowledged through an ethical review process at the university that you work in. You can use your own journals that don't identify people, but if you want to go beyond just saying, I think this, I felt that, you need to have other data as well. And so when I came to Brock, for example, I immediately completed ethical review forms to give permission for me to use data for my students. And at Brock, I can say, and I think at a lot of other institutions, it's not that hard to get permission to study your own practices. You have to then protect your students by getting consent, giving them ways of opting out, making sure that they're safe and not identifiable in your data, and so on. But my students have always been very happy to let me study my practice. I think they realize I'll be better if I'm actually taking the time to study my practice, because if you're not going to be just going through the motions if you're going to the trouble of actually studying it as well. I think it's good if you were thinking about starting self-study, you have to start somewhere. One way is to start by studying a practice, to ask a question, to say, why don't I study a lesson? For one lesson, I'm going to try something a little bit different, and then how will that go? Or I'm going to focus on one particular aspect of practice. When I wrote about reflective practice portfolios, I collected data from multiple years that I had collected from students and took a look at that. So I was saying, how can I improve one of my practices, how I write responses to reflective work? So taking a particular practice or a particular lesson and then writing about it. In that way, it's a bit like action research, for example, where you ask a question, you then collect data to see how your change in practice is affecting your performance, and then it is an iterative feedback loop. You learn from this, and then you presumably change your practice a little bit more in order to do better. You can also start by studying your identity. There's a lot of self-studies by teacher educators who are new, and it's still fresh to them, although there's been ones now for 10 years in the journal. New teacher educator discovers what it's like to teach in the university, or discovers what it's like to shift from being a classroom teacher to being a teacher educator. So one can talk about identity. It's always nice, if you're thinking about doing that today, to put a different spin on it. A white male, female, of relative privilege, teaching other white male, female students in a faculty of education. You may still be doing that, but what's the spin you can use on it? Maybe about a certain aspect of it, or working in a minority student context, or dealing with one's own ethnic identity, whatever. So how do you find a fresh spin on the classic story of transitioning into the university? But it's certainly an area to think about. It's also important to think about the methods you apply. One of the things that I like about self-study, and Tim alluded to this already, is its flexibility in borrowing and mixing methods, that it is a mongrel approach. And as I said, some of my written work has actually technically not been self-study. It's been an action research project. And I've just said, what would be the best place to write up something here? And sometimes I just say, I'll write it up for an action research journal. But fundamentally, to me, it's still a self-study. So what methods will work for your particular study? And then even plan that in advance. And if you have methods that you've already used or that are part of your current discourse community, scholarship of teaching or action research, then maybe start there and maybe combine that with a little bit more reflection than you might have used in past work. So I draw heavily on narrative inquiry and reflective practice and action research because that's what I know, but there's many other ways that people can do. Also, as Tim said, it isn't navel-gazing because we spend a lot of time talking to each other, critical friends, collaborative research communities, and so on. And it's really important that one share the work with other people. And the self-study community has been one where people have been eager to share, both in their own institutions and across countries as well. We had a self-study group that was quite active in this faculty of education for a number of years, and it kind of atrophied over time as we all got too busy with other things, and we just, and I guess I didn't show leadership in making sure that it continued. So, but that kind of thing happens with communities as well. But collaboration really is crucial. And then finally, the last thing I would challenge people to think about, because the title is Self-Study of Teaching and Teacher Education Practices, is most of you are not teacher educators. You're in other parts of the university or college setting. So the method doesn't need to be exclusive to teaching teachers. So I sort of throw out the idea of a self-study of higher education practices, that there's no reason that these methods could not be used in other areas, either a particular field or more generally asking questions about how do we teach students in a university setting. So I challenge people to think about that. And at Brock, I certainly offer myself and Tim, as he agreed to be offered up, as people who might be willing to help get something set up here if there was an interest in that. So in conclusion, I have shared my story to illustrate the richness self-study can bring to professional practice and scholarship. I have also outlined a number of possibilities for getting started individually and collectively. Combining teaching and scholarship makes you a better teacher, and it contributes to your scholarship. It is a way of serving both our masters and helps us become reflective and well-integrated professionals in the process. I thank you for coming, and I hope that you take the opportunity to engage in the study of higher education practices. Thank you.
I'll just try and co-chair from up here. Does anyone in the audience have questions for Julian at this point? Maureen Conley.
Let me get your mic. No, I can give it.
Maureen Connolly, Faculty of Applied Health Sciences. So congrats on the full professor. But that's sort of where I wanted to go with my question, is the suspicion among colleagues about methodologies that are based in ongoing writing, that it somehow interferes with your ability to write. So I find that ironic, that there's resistance inside faculties to methodologies like self-study, which are based in writing, ongoing writing actually, and yet the understanding among colleagues at the faculty levels, and certainly outside the faculty who don't do this methodology, there's a lot of suspicion. So I guess my question, and maybe it's a self-study of higher education practices question, is how do we educate colleagues on the legitimacy of different research forms and different methodological forms, so that in our promotion and tenure practices, where I spend an inordinate amount of time, as you know, in our promotion and tenure practices, how do we educate in a way that isn't sort of tokenistic, you know, so that people say, okay, fine, we'll accept it because you guys do it, but more to the point that it's legitimate. I think still in higher education, we have some significant silos around what constitutes legitimate scholarship. That's it.
Yeah. Okay. I would approach it a number of ways. One is, in many institutions, including our own, the scholarship of teaching is viewed as important, and there's a literature on that. And this sort of connects to that, albeit in a different way, because it's more reflective about one's own practice. So I would tie it to the scholarship of teaching. One of the best ways to measure whether the work is meaningful for the promotion and tenure process is the legitimacy of the journals in which it is disseminated. So if you can get a self-study of a practice published in, let's say, a physical education kinesiology journal that's respected, then it counts. So whatever your colleagues think about it, objectively they should be able to say, if a peer-reviewed journal of some note in my field respects it, then it has to count here. Well, it should. I see Maureen not shaking her head. I know, but in my faculty, that's happened, and I've published in it. One thing that was really helpful is, for instance, the Studying Teacher Education Journal is a highly ranked journal in the field of education, so that gives legitimacy. So if someone says it's not legitimate, it's getting legitimacy. There's a handbook of studying teacher education. So again, legitimacy. So stake it out that way. The other thing is it improves practice. And we know at universities where there's a commitment to practice that they can also get in the way of scholarship. And one thing I would comment about with Brock is that people tend to be very committed to their practice. In fact, often professors don't get around to applying for research grants until too late because they're too busy making sure they're teaching their courses well. And by then, they can no longer be counted as junior scholars. So actually, this is a way to focus on doing your teaching well by identifying something you're going to study while doing it. So you're working on making your, in my case, professionalism and law class, a better class for the students, and you're writing an article about it at the same time. So you're contributing to your scholarship. It isn't taking an inordinate amount of extra time to do that, and it's contributing to your scholarship. And then you get better known in the community. So that, for instance, I'm writing a chapter for an international handbook on teacher education. Well, the people who are editing that know me through my work in self-study, and they're giving me an opportunity to do something that's not self-study. So, and a handbook is a fairly prestigious thing. So self-study has helped me. So I think we need to make those cases, and maybe we sometimes need to make the cases by saying, well, look at those people in another faculty are getting recognition as well. So it's not an easy process, but especially in universities with an emphasis on teaching, we should be valuing the scholarship of teaching and valuing professional articles that come out in that area.
Thank you very much to Julian again for his presentation and for the contribution to the symposium today. Just as a word of note to the people out there in the web, there were some questions sent in previously from people, and I think it's worth just noting that I think Julian probably answered a couple of those questions in his presentation, particularly some questions from Beth Dorman. Hi, Beth. In what ways does self-study differ from action research, and in what other fields besides teacher education is self-study being applied? So those are two questions that come up. At this point, we're going to go to a video that was sent in from Tom Russell. Tom sent in his apologies for not being able to make it, but we're especially grateful for the time that he took to make this video. Tom Russell is Professor in the Faculty of Education at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He was among the first group of scholars to work with and establish self-study of teacher education practices methodology, which we'll hear about in his talk. He's founding co-editor of the journal Studying Teacher Education, which we've spoken about, and is responsible for coordinating the celebrated Castle Conference at Herstmonceux Castle, which is a focal point of the self-study research community, and which will appear in its 11th edition in the summer of 2016. For those people interested, I think a call for papers for the Castle Conference is going out in the next couple of months. The website is castleconference.com if you're interested. Tom has authored or edited many important works in self-study research, and it's a privilege to have him participate in the symposium, albeit in a virtual version of himself. Just on a very logistical issue, the sound quality may not be at its best, but just crowd in on your computer and try and pay close attention to what Tom's going to talk about. Also, I'd like to make a point that for people in whose fields self-study is fairly new, in this talk you'll hear that self-study methodology isn't particularly new. There is a rich history that goes back more than 20 years, and Tom's going to talk about that. So in making those connections to the work that has been done, Tom's going to give you an introduction to that.
Hello, my name is Tom Russell, and I'm speaking to you from my office in the Faculty of Education at Queen's University, where I'm finishing my 38th year as a teacher educator. And Tim and Déirdre have invited me to provide some background for you on the origins of the self-study of teacher education practices special interest group within AERA, and also some background on the origins of the conference that's held every 2 years at Herstmonceux Castle in England. My apologies for not being with you in person. It's about a 4.5-hour journey to get from one end of Lake Ontario to the other, and with the end of classes next week, it would have missing the next to last class with my students was going to be difficult in addition to the travel time. I congratulate Tim and Déirdre on organizing this event and the interest it's attracted, and I hope you all have find it very productive, and that it draws you into self-study. The theme through what I want to discuss is probably best summed up by the word serendipity. My own career and the good turns that have happened throughout those 38 years could largely be characterized by serendipity. I started here in 1977, and the first serendipitous event was the publication in 1983 of Donald Schoen's The Reflective Practitioner, How Professionals Think in Action. I was captivated. It seemed to speak to the problems I was sensing between the students, what was happening in my classes with people preparing to teach science, biology, chemistry, or physics at the secondary level, and what I was seeing them do when I went to observe them during their practicum placements. The gap was huge, and reflective practice and reflection in action, as discussed by Schoen, seemed to be very relevant. So I jumped into that, and by the time 1987 arrived, I was on my second research grant related to reflective practice and how it might apply to people who were learning to teach. And I had an opportunity to speak at the University of Arizona about reflective practice and my interest in it. And the greatest response that I got at Arizona came from 4 people who were all graduate students at the time. You may know them as because they've written on numerous occasions as the Arizona Four: Stephanie Pinniger, Mary Lynn Hamilton, Karen Guilfoyle, and Peggy Placier. Several things had happened. We stayed in contact. We had a very exciting first meeting, and email had arrived or was beginning to arrive, and we stayed in contact. Met at meetings of AERA. In 1991, I had the unusual opportunity, or created the unusual opportunity, to return to the high school physics classroom, where I taught one class for 75 minutes a day, one complete first physics course in grade 11 in high school from September to January. I had many extensive conversations with the Arizona Four about they had then moved into faculties of education in 4 different locations in the States. We put together a symposium at AERA in 1992 in San Francisco, and so the 5 of us presented our own experiences, trying to take a closer look at what was happening in our teacher education classrooms. Our discussant was Fred Kortagen, whom I'd had the good fortune to meet at a conference in 1987 in England. And again, we had stayed in contact and found many common interests in teacher education. At the small room at AERA for that 1992 symposium was packed, and there were some very interesting comments from the audience at the end of the symposium. And one person in the back of the room, by the name of Beth Ann Herman, put her hand up and said, we should explore developing a special interest group around work like this, that many other teacher educators would probably be interested in it. Another moment of serendipity, that also happened to be the event where I first met John Loughran, whom many of you will know for his extensive writing in the area of self-study. 2 years later, in 1993, the SIG was launched at the AERA meeting in Atlanta, and immediately had a subscription of, I think, over 300 members. And to this day, the SSTEP SIG has remained one of the larger special interest groups within AERA. In 1994, several members of the Arizona Four and I attended a conference on action learning organized by Jack Whitehead at the University of Bath in England. That was in early July of 1994, and just before going to Bath, my wife and I had made a trip to East Sussex in England, because Queen's University had just recently acquired a castle there, which has now become the Bader International Study Center of Queen's University. The grounds opened in July of 1994, and we were, since we were in England, we were curious to see it. We were fascinated. Took many pictures, had them developed. Those were the days when we developed photos, and we showed them to our friends in the Arizona Four at the conference in Bath. And I believe it was Stephanie Pinniger who piped up and said, Tom, we have to have a conference there. this is another case where, as they say, the rest is history. 8 or 9 of my colleagues and our new dean here at Queen's were eager to organize and be involved in a conference about self-study at Herstmonceux Castle, and the first conference did happen in July of 1996. Here's a photograph of Herstmonceux Castle. This is the image that one sees on first arriving at the castle, and you can see why people might be attracted to a location such as this. I call it the best conference venue for a group of 100 people anywhere on the planet. It's a 30-minute walk to the nearest village, and the fact that we're all on site together, unfortunately we don't stay in the castle, we stay in a nearby residence, but everything else at the conference, including meals, meetings, and the pub, all happen inside the castle. So here's a copy of the proceedings of the first conference at the castle, and we had our 10th castle conference last summer. You can see that we've done an upgrade in terms of the cover attractiveness. This is largely the work of Alan Ovens and Don Garbett at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. One of the things I need to mention is about the Castle Conference is that we've been extremely fortunate to have a large cross-section of international English-speaking representation right from the start. Countries that have been involved from the start include the States and Canada, obviously, but also Australia and New Zealand. We've certainly had people from the Netherlands, from Iceland. We've had good participation from Israel, people from South Africa, and most recently we've had participants from Spain and Chile. So the conference seems to be has certainly been a strong part of what's kept the group going, in addition to the presentations that are made in sessions at the AERA meetings every year. I'll take just a moment further to say a little bit more about how things developed after the conference, the first conference. Again, in a moment of serendipity, I was fortunate to make contact with Malcolm Clarkson, who was then the editor of Falmer Press. That has since moved on into becoming Routledge Falmer, and then more recently simply Routledge. Malcolm was a fascinating person who was very good to academics who were early in their publishing careers. Hugh Munby and I published a book with him in 1992, and in 1995 Fred Cortagan and I published a book, Teachers Who Teach Teachers, Reflections on Teacher Education. The next book that appeared was Reconceptualizing Teaching Practice, Self-Study and Teacher Education, and this may be the first book that first names the idea of self-study in the title. This book was edited by Mary Lynn as the senior editor with additional work from Stephanie Pinniger, Tom Russell, John Loughran, and Vicki Lebowski. I mentioned the serendipitous moment of meeting John Loughran at the 1992 AER meeting where we presented that symposium, and John and I have had a very satisfying career publishing together, in addition to the publications that we've done individually and with others. In 1997 we published Teaching About Teaching, Purpose, Passion, and Pedagogy in Teacher Education, which has many elements of self-study. And by 2002 we'd arrived at improving teacher education practices through self-study. many of you will be aware, and this was largely through the incredible leadership that John offered, and Marilyn Hamilton, Vicki Lebowski, and I were editors of individual sections. But the 2-volume International Handbook of Self-Study of Teaching and Teacher Education Practices in 2004 certainly gave the enterprise of self-study a larger recognition. And again, through the hard work that John put in communicating with potential publishers, the journal Studying Teacher Education, a journal of self-study of teacher education practices, was launched in 2005. John and I were the initial co-editors, and I'm now very pleased to be working with Mandy Berry as a co-editor, and the journal has just published the first issue of its 11th year. I think that's probably as much as I should say, and I thank you for your attention, and I hope this background has been helpful. I wish you a very stimulating series of conversations in your meetings today. Thanks very much.
Thanks to Tom, and from his presentation you can see he's a bit of a legend, and we're particularly honoured because I believe this was his first ever video presentation. So as much as he's done, we're all still learning and doing new things. If you wouldn't mind holding your questions about Tom's talk until the open discussion at the end, where the other presenters will address those questions. Okay, I have the honour now of introducing Clare Kosnik, who's a professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies of Education at the University of Toronto. She's currently the associate editor of the journal Studying Teacher Education, and she's the past chair of the STEP SIG at AERA. Along with Clive Beck, she's conducting one of the largest longitudinal studies of teachers. So she's been following a group of 20 students who are now in their 12th year of teaching. And that work is going to continue, and self-study is an important part of that research programme. Clare is going to talk to us on the title, Using Self-Study as Part of a Broader Programme of Research. Thanks, Clare.
Okay, thank you, Déirdre. And I know there's been some problems with the mic, so if you don't think you can hear me, just let me know. So hello to everyone here. Hello to our friends who are connecting online. Maybe you're sitting in your living room having a cup of tea with the community, but I'm really glad to be part of this day. So thank you, Tim and Déirdre, for organizing, getting the funding, and including me. And I'm really excited about my talk today because it's something I've never really talked about before, so we're going to find out how it goes. So, often I will be in my institution, which is, powerhouse research place, and you'll hear people, oh, I do narrative, oh, I do autoethnography. And you sort of have to have a label on yourself, and I don't really like labels. And this sort of concerned me because then I think, oh, what kind of research am I doing? And as someone said, you're a bit concerned about talking about doing self-study. So, I read this really good quote from Strauss, who says, the basic question facing us is how to capture the complexity of the reality we study and how to make convincing sense of it. And Arbor Cole, who was one of the founders of the self-study movement, she was at OISE, she's now in Nova Scotia. She was an expert in research methodology. She used to say to me over and over again, Clare, your data is only going to be as good as your instruments. So which leads us into, hopefully this will work, combining traditional research and self-study research. Okay, I do not see the two as in opposition. I see them as working beautifully together. And I'm going to give you 3 examples from my own experiences of how self-study informed more traditional forms of research. So having to have a label of what kind of research I do, so quietly whisper self-study, and then I say I do grounded theory. Yeah, now grounded theory, you know, and I think I do grounded theory, but one of the issues with grounded theory is you're investigating, as Strauss said, but you have to know what questions to ask. And when you were exploring, you don't necessarily know the questions to ask. And this is where self-study has helped me. So one of my first forays into self-study was I went from being an administrator in a school district to a teacher educator. And this was before all the research came out about transition from classroom teacher to university professor. Well, I quickly learned that I didn't really know very much. I'd been a pretty good classroom teacher, but I really didn't know what I was necessarily doing as a teacher educator. And I started looking around, and there really was not a lot written about being a teacher educator. I was teaching literacy methods courses, and like, what do I do? Because I quickly realized what I did as a classroom teacher didn't work in higher education. So Arthur Cole sort of planted that seed about starting to study your own practice. And since I couldn't really find a lot of books other than the one by Cochrane and Lytle, what to do, I thought, all right, I'll study myself. So I looked at critical incidents over a course of a year. I looked at what were my priorities as a classroom teacher and what are my priorities now as a teacher educator. And I thought, well, this is sort of interesting. I learned a tremendous amount, but I'm not really that interesting. I needed more than just me. So I decided that I needed to look at other teacher educators. So did some small studies looking at the contract faculty to look at their work, their transition, but then I wanted to go bigger. So I was super, super lucky to get a grant to study 28 literacy, English, language arts, depending what country you're in, teacher educators, those who are preparing student teachers to teach literacy, language arts, English. And they're from 4 countries, Canada, the US, Australia, and England. And when, I recruited all the folks, but then I had to develop the interview questions. And I had funding to do 3 interviews. So the first interview was on their background experiences, the second was on their pedagogy, and the third was on use of digital technology. And when we were developing the 3 parts of the study, you could see each part linked back to a self-study I had done. So that looking at yourself as a classroom teacher, I didn't want to do your transition from classroom teacher to teacher educator because, as Julian said, that had been done. But I took a different spin on looking at what were your priorities as a classroom teacher, what are your priorities now as a teacher educator. That's what I had done. Myself, I saw a one-to-one correspondence in my own work, and lo and behold, with my 28 folks, I found the same continuity. I asked folks to draw a timeline of their personal and professional turning points. And because I had looked at my own turning points, and I asked them to do that, and I discovered, much like my story, that people went back to their early childhood, into their early school experiences to see what has shaped them as teacher educators. And I found the same in mine. And one of the questions I asked was, is there a hierarchy in your teacher education department or school of education, depending on the context? Well, that just blew the microphone right off, because I was doing these interviews by Skype. And I had felt this tremendous hierarchy as a literacy teacher educator, and lo and behold, almost every place, whether it's teaching focused, research intensive, our participants felt there was a hierarchy. And I would never have thought to ask that question if I had not been studying my own practice. And then Julian showed us the slide of self-study wanting to be improvement oriented. So I was trying to improve my practice, and I thought, here it is. I've got these amazing teacher educators. I wanted to know about their pedagogies. I wanted to know about the goals for their courses. And I knew from some smaller studies that if you ask people about their assignments, you find out what their courses are really about. So my smaller studies of teacher educators, my own self-studies, completely informed this large-scale study of literacy teacher educators. We've already had a number of journal articles published in prestigious journals, and someone said, how do you make the case for self-study in tenure and promotion? Well, I think this is a perfect example that you use your self-study to inform your larger research. That's what I put down on my tenure page. So, second study is digital technology. Every year, my student teachers would say, I wish there was more technology in the literacy course. Claire's very engaging, she's organized, but more on digital technology. So 3 years ago, I decided, okay, I'm going to do this. This is going to be my focus. I am going to integrate digital technology into my literacy methods courses. And I thought, oh, perfect opportunity to do a self-study. I can't tell you how glad I am. So I did the self-study with my TA, Lydia Mena, when we taught together for years, so it was sort of like co-teaching. We had a critical friend, Sean Bullock, who's like the expert on digital technology. So we did this over 3 years. The first year I discovered we integrated about 34 different things into the courses, so we're feeling pretty proud of ourselves. But if it hadn't been for self-study, I would have just been quite satisfied with myself and proud. But through the analysis, I discovered that I really hadn't done anything new. I had only layered digital technology onto an existing course. I had replaced the overhead projector with fancy PowerPoints or websites. I had not really looked at supporting student teachers' learning. So I was a bit disappointed, but however, Sean, Lydia, and I, we worked very hard over 2 years on integrating digital technology in a way to support student-teacher learning. So that was a great self-study because even though it was so humbling to realize how completely ineffective we were initially, it did lead us to become far more effective. So in my study of 28 literacy teacher educators, in the first interview, we asked folks, are there any gaps in your knowledge? Because again, I know about big gaps in my knowledge, and so many people said technology. So in the third interview, we had a whole section on digital technology, the interviews. But my self-study informed the questions I was going to ask. So yeah, I asked them questions, but sort of what did you do? And because I had been working on it, I sort of knew what they were talking about. So if they said voice thread, I said, oh yeah, I know what that is. Or if they talked about like a different platform, I knew about that. But I also knew to ask, because this had been one of my biggest challenges, how did you know what to do? Because that was what really came, one of the many things that came through my self-study research is I didn't really have any models. I did not know what integrating digital technology into a literacy methods course looks like. So I asked folks, how did you know what to do? Thinking, I'm going to find out, that there's some holy grail out there, there's some book I'm missing, only to discover that everybody like me, it was trial and error. Which I think there is a big gap. If someone's looking for a research project or a big publication, what does digital technology look like in literacy methods courses? So that prompted me to get a connection grant to bring together 17 experts in digital technology, literacy, teacher education, and teacher education to London last June to say, what should we be doing and what should it look like? Because I saw there was a need. So we're going to do a book on that, and that was just really fascinating. but also in my self-study. Looking at my reflective notes, the number of times I said how inadequate I was. I could not get over the number of times I used failure-like words to describe myself, how inept I was. And then Lydia and I started talking about, it's this whole concept of digital native versus digital immigrant. And so this took us into identity. And then Sean said, you've got to read Neil Selwyn. I now am in love with Neil Selwyn. If somebody from Monash is listening to this, I mean, I have now read so much by him. So the self-study research, I didn't just rely on the literature related to self-study. It took me into Neil Selwyn's work, which then prompted me in my study of the literacy English language arts teacher educators to talk about how they felt about themselves regarding digital technology. So do you have time for a third one, or no? It's okay? All right. So can you see how these were informing each other? So now I'm going to give you something that's totally different. As Tom said, there's serendipitous incidents that happen in life. I was pretty busy, like I'm pretty busy, you know, like everybody in this room. You know, we've got our teaching, our research, our service. And principal of a school, an independent school, asked me to help start a teacher research group in her high school. Long and the short of it is, I do. I say, yes, I will help. And I had 2 of my doc students help me. The reason why I was reluctant was A, I was busy, B, it was secondary school. I'm an elementary school teacher, in case you can't tell, former grade 1 teacher. And I was going to be working with people I did not know, which normally, if you're starting a teacher research group, you know some of the participants. So I thought, here is a time for us to do a self-study on us as facilitators. When we are completely external, we don't know the norms, we don't know the procedures, we don't even know the codes for the photocopier in a school. How is it for us being facilitators? I'm so glad we did the self-study. So our teacher research group has been going for 2 years. And so we do reflections, we do notes, and we realized we were learning a lot about ourselves. We learned a lot about the secondary school curriculum. I didn't even know there were courses like urban geography, but anyway. But then we wanted to hear from the participants. You know, we have 12 teachers. And we looked back at our findings from our self-study, and that guided some of the development of some of the questions, because our findings had to do with logistics of the group, about our identity as moving from outsiders to insiders, and what we learned about facilitation, secondary school curriculum. But so when we were surveying our teachers, we asked them about the logistics of the meetings, because they're monthly meetings, their identity. Are they feeling like researchers? How has their identity changed? And what were they learning? So the questions we constructed tied right back to our findings from our self-study. So those are 3 examples. Now, Tim started off showing a picture of a mongrel. There's Poochie, little Abby, who shows up in every presentation I do. But I say, combining different methodologies, it doesn't create a mongrel, it creates something very beautiful, something very special. Now, can you tell how special he is in my life? How much I have learned about myself and being a pet owner. So it's not a mongrel, I think it's just an absolutely just beautiful product. And if you're sort of interested in some of our work, again, part of our integration of digital technology is we started a website. We have a really, really active blog. All of the studies we have done are there. our longitudinal study, that we have the instruments, the findings, copies of our papers and books, and the self-studies and traditional studies I have done, everything is available on our website. So thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you for Tim and Déirdre, and any hard questions I'm giving to Tom.
Actually, Claire, if you could just stay up. Does anyone in the room have questions for Claire that they would like to ask? Okay. Thank you very much, Claire. Claire was my PhD supervisor as well, and introduced me to self-study. Yeah, thank you very much for coming and for all the help.
My pleasure.
We have time for some open questions, and some of which have been sent in. I've asked Claire to stay up here for one reason, because one of the questions that was sent in from Anne McPhail, who's at the University of Limerick in Ireland. Hello, Anne. She sent along this question, which we were discussing prior to the symposium starting. Anne's question is, in approaching self-study, where does one legitimately start, given that our history and prior experiences contribute to our understanding of self, pedagogical beliefs, approaches and practices, and so on? So rather than giving the hard questions to me, I'm going to give it back to you. So
Thanks, Tim. I think that's a great question. For me, there is no time like the present to start. So I say start your self-study right now. And think of, what is it I want to study? Come up with your questions. But now I think Anne's question really gets at what my previous history. As you can see, my previous history, as a classroom teacher, how that's affected me. You can't do self-study retroactively. You can't say, oh, I'm going to do a study of my transition from classroom teacher to teacher educator, but you've already been a teacher educator for 5 years. So I can't do it retroactively, but you do want to capture how your previous experiences, personally and professionally, are influencing you. So a couple ways to get around this. One of the is to say, I am going to do a timeline of the pivotal experiences I have had personally and professionally. And then you look at that and you say, okay, I am here now. And then you can start identifying what were the influences on your practice, and why do you now see these as really important? Or how have they influenced your practice? And you may want to write some of your own story, to take parts of your story from that timeline that you see influencing you now, to flesh them out a little bit. So in your current self-study, you can look at your timeline, some of your reflections, to help you create the questions, your interview questions you're going to ask with other people, or exactly what you're going to study. Does that sort of help, Tim, or any more elaboration?
No, I think so. A really important point that Claire raised in our conversation earlier is the point that self-studies aren't just reflections on the past. Not all studies of self are self-studies. And that was something that Claire said when I was being introduced to self-study, that it's, you start with a research question and move from the present forward. You can draw from the past to think about how the past is influencing your present and future ideas, but it's not just, well, here's my biography. In and of itself, that would be a sort of life history.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it a little bit complicated, because you are going back and forth, present, future, past, but that's probably the way we all work. We don't follow this nice linear path. Okay.
Thank you. The other question that was sent in was from Karen Vincent, who's at Canterbury Christchurch University in England. Her question was, there appears to be a wealth of research supporting early childhood teachers as researchers. She's working in early childhood education. But far less research within self-study practices of the teacher educators preparing student teachers to teach young children. Why do you think this might be the case? I think, in a nutshell, she's probably getting at an issue that's that spreads across the self-study research community, that a lot of the focus has been on the student teachers, the people learning to become professionals, and not so much on the practices of the people who are teaching them. This question applies across all spectrum. About the why? Would you like to comment? Yeah.
To add to Tim, in North America, a lot of the early childhood education is done in colleges. Not as much is done in universities. So conferences like AERA, where you do have a special interest group on self-study, the community college folks, the college folks, may not have the opportunity to attend. So they are not as much part of sort of the international community from the North American perspective. And I'm not sure how it is in Australia, but I think they've been a little bit less active in the big international conferences by virtue of the institutions they work in, because they often don't have the same funding opportunities for travel and not necessarily the same expectations for research, because they tend to work in very teaching intensive places.
Would you like to mention? If you're looking for additional information in that area, people like Linda Fitzgerald at University of Northern Iowa would be a good place to go. There are people who are doing work in that field within teacher education. So she and her colleagues there, Catherine Eastwood, and so on, would be a good place to go. Oh, sorry, Jill. Okay. This is a question you probably should be asking Claire, because I haven't been involved in major, really large projects. But I do think that there's first of all, a huge need for that. I think Ken Zeichner, with his challenge, is saying, so what? You discovered that you did something nice that really worked for your students, and now you're a little bit better for it, and your students learned a little bit more. And so we have to do more than that. We have to ask questions at this stage in the self-study community's experience. We need to ask questions that are bigger. Individually, we need to ask, how can I improve my practice? But collectively, we need to pool together. So I think the kind of thing you're talking about is really important. And also, we need, for instance, have literacy teachers talk to literacy teachers, or phys ed teachers talk to phys ed teachers. I think that's really crucial. But also within institutions, we need to have more self-studies where, for instance, teacher educators in a faculty talk to each other about what they're doing. And when I was at ARA this year, one of the lenses that I was viewing things from was having basically almost completed a chapter on approaches to teacher education internationally. So people were saying, I did this in my institution, in my course. My course is now a little bit better. But if my course is only taught by me and then maybe some sessional instructors who are doing it differently, and then they're also taking another 10 courses in the program, and they're not being done in the same way, how much difference has your course really made? I don't want to minimize the accomplishment, because that's what I spent a lot of my time on. But I was asking that question. So we need to have integrated teacher education programs, or integrated kinesiology programs, or English programs. How do we make them meaningful? And so therefore, there's a challenge that we need to do that work together. So that's what I'm starting to ask myself bigger questions, because I may have been at it longer. And the individual part is important, but the collective is more important. In terms of the size mattering, I think you probably have to have ways of having people cluster in small groups as well as large, because it is hard to get everybody together. At Brock, in my faculty, we have multiple programs, we have more than one campus, and one of the challenges is just finding time to connect. So maybe having ways that people could go into subgroups. The web might help with that, because there's various ways of using chat rooms and asynchronous connection and so on. So I think large-scale studies are really important, but also they're challenging, and so maybe finding ways to allow for smaller scale groups to work within it, so that it's a complex system rather than a complicated system, I think would be really important. And then the logistics of getting 28 people or so to work together, that part Claire can answer, because she's brilliant at it.
I think that's a really great question. One, what I would be guided by, and this is, again, something I learned from Déirdre Ní, is what is your research question? So will you have 28 people all wanting to study the same thing? Maybe not. So I would try to have your clusters, maybe 4 or 6 people who are all studying the same thing, because I think it's important with the self-study that you got what it is, your question and sub-questions really clearly identified and what your instruments are. So I think trying to find 28 people across institutions who all want to study the same thing may be difficult, but you could have 4 clusters who then come together and you share some of your findings. So that might be another way to go at it.
And one piece to just add to that, if you're in smaller clusters, it allows for people to have papers from it, because if you're author number 28 on a large study, there's no reward in that. So having opportunities to work in smaller groups can lead to conference presentations and other papers beyond the large-scale one that the leaders of the group would be doing. People can also take advantage of it to write some smaller-scale papers, because if you're 28th author, in some ways you might as well not have bothered writing. So therefore, it can allow for a number of different things, and maybe edited volumes of work. So again, you can shift the author order and things like that.
So this is what you are for the folks who can't see. Yeah, I agree.
I agree, and thank you for that. I think that we might also want to look at having people ask similar questions, so that you could have 10 math teachers or 20 math teachers asking similar questions about practice, and then having, in addition to individual or small group self-studies, some meta-analysis of the data. Like, because I think people are saying, okay, so 20 different people wrote math self-studies. what do we learn about that in order to be better math teacher educators or better math teachers? So I think there's some way, I think, first of all, self-study improves our practice immediately. So the first main good of a self-study is my classroom work just got better. My students have benefited. And then we can learn from those individual self-studies when they're shared. But I think we needed to do some aggregation at times to see what can we learn as lessons across a series of self-studies. And I think Zeichner and in the ARA book about studying teacher education said it's very hard to use in larger studies because it seems idiosyncratic. It's not idiosyncratic, but if there's some ways that we can cluster, then I think it can start to have a bigger impact on the field as a whole. But you always lose something by going to scale, and Clive's absolutely correct about that. But you can also gain things in sharing that with a larger community. My main interest is how sharing together collaboratively among a group of people will lead to not just better individual practice, but better practice in the program. And I'm really interested in how do you build a better, more integrated teacher education program. And to me, that means that different people need to be working together on that. They can't just make their individual courses better and then they're not stitched together in a way that's meaningful. It's just like having cloth rather than a suit. You want to have the suit as well.
Thank you. Another question from the Twitterverse, and I think I dug a hole for myself because this is something that I said. What is the difference between self-study and a study of self? Very quickly, from my perspective at least, self-study has to include a self in practice, and a study of self has the potential to lose the practice when the focus is just on the self. That is very autoethnographic, which isn't a problem, but from my perspective, self-study needs to be the self in practice. So that's my simple response.
One of the challenges, Association for Teacher Education, we have the self-study SIG, and people will submit something because, oh, I study myself, that's the right spot. And it's not self-study because it doesn't study them in practice. And also it doesn't acknowledge that there's a literature in the field now that can be drawn upon that's rich. So it is much more than just studying yourself. With the name, Tom sometimes likes to use S-STEP instead of self-study because the abbreviation self-study ends up ignoring of teacher education practices. And a different name might have acknowledged practices too much and put the self-study in the background. So both need to be constantly in the foreground. It's teacher education practices and it's self-study, and it's the intersection of the two that's at the heart of it.
A number of folks have mentioned about the community of self-study. Deb Tidwell did the most wonderful, wonderful book chapter on the mores and values of the STEP community. So Deb Tidwell, Tidwell, and it's in a book called Learning Communities that was edited, the first editor was Anastasia Samaras. So if you're sort of piqued by what you've heard today, you might want to read more. She did a beautiful history and what the culture at that moment was of self-study.
This is the last question that we have sent from Jamie McMullen, again at University of Limerick. So thanks, Jamie. How can we teach undergrad students, or I suppose teacher candidates, pre-service teachers, perhaps, to engage in self-study when they enter the field as teachers? So this is taking the focus away from teacher educators doing self-study to perhaps teaching teachers how to do self-study. Is that something that, and that's, I think, Anastasia Samaras' book is Self-Study of Teaching Practice. That's the angle that she takes, how to have teachers or prospective teachers use self-study. Do you have any response?
I have probably a controversial response to that. Having studied with Clyde Beck, 45 beginning teachers, they're surviving. Okay, so, however, I do not despair. So I think, in response to the question, in teacher education, we need to be making explicit to our student teachers what our study of our practice is. So every year I tell my student teachers, this is what I'm studying. For example, with the digital technology, I said, I'm working on this in over 3 years. So I modeled it for them, made it explicit, and tried to connect them into some of the self-study communities and said, you know, maybe as a beginning teacher, this, you know, you might be a little bit overwhelmed, but you can, when you stay connected to your student teachers as I do, you can sort of keep inviting them, reminding them, and so they've been introduced to self-study in their teacher ed program.
I would answer from a couple of perspectives. One is at Brock, we're starting our 2-year teacher education program next year. So moving to 2 years from 1 has allowed space to open up. So we have a teacher researcher course, which won't be just self-study or reflective practice, but be other research as well, and will be how you consume research. But that certainly gives an opportunity to hopefully add research and research of oneself as a practitioner during that time. And then also I know I'm in charge of redesigning the secondary cohort course, and there'll be a lot of self-reflection and examination of one's practices there. So I think you can integrate, I think you need to integrate it into your teacher education program, that if students see research into self and research into practice as valuable, then they're more likely to be receptive to doing it themselves later on. So that's a challenge. The second thing, and I was reminded of this because of Clare and Clive, having been a researcher on their project for a couple of years, I would suggest that the people in the project became better teachers because they had to answer questions about practice from the research team. So that while they weren't engaged in self-study, they were engaged in reflecting on their practice because some researchers came in and asked questions about it. And then I think they became more mindful of their own practice as well. So what I'd like to see is teacher induction programs within school boards could build in research. And I think self-study research is excellent because it's about the self and practice, and especially as a new teacher, you're asking, how am I doing? What am I doing? Is what I'm doing working? Do they like me? Those kinds of things. And who am I? And I think that self-study could be a really great tool within teacher induction programs in making for better teachers. And then finally, Darling Hammond and others have said we need to develop a discourse of teachers as adaptive experts. And adaptive experts need to be aware of themselves, they need to be aware of their practice, they need to be aware of the context in which they teach. So adaptive expertise can be really cultivated through a self-study stance, where teacher candidates see themselves as researchers and teachers see themselves as researchers. When I wrote my article for Action Research, one of the findings, remember one of the candidates said something to the effect of, now having done an action research project, I see myself as not just a consumer or as a technician, I see myself as a researcher. And so I think that self-study or other complementary methods can have a really important role in helping teachers to think more complexly about their practice.
Well, thank you very much to Clare Kosnik and Julian Kitchen again, and to Tom Russell in a virtual sense. So if the audience could please just give our keynote speakers. Thank you also to the live audience members for your participation and questions, and also to the people who have contributed with questions in advance or through Twitter today. And the engagement for today's symposium has been wonderful. So thank you very much for your participation. Again, thank you to the keynote speakers, the participants online and in person. The participants online, thank you, and that could be going for years on end. Who knows? Because this version of today will be archived, so hopefully people will be able to access this for several years afterwards. Again, it will be accessible through the Self-Study SIG website, which is hosted by AERA, and we'll provide information about that. You can email me or Déirdre Ní Chróinín about that in the future. So please keep the conversation going about self-study using the Twitter hashtags that we've created, but also just amongst people who you're working with in your institutions, in your subject areas, wherever that may be. So we hope that today's given you a taste for self-study, what it could be and how to get started going about it, whether you're a teacher educator, a coach, or any type of person who's interested in studying your own practice, whatever that institution may be. I'd like to finish off, I guess, enjoy the months ahead, and good luck with the extensive reading list that you've been provided with today. It will keep you going well into the summer. If you are interested, or if you're doing self-studies at the moment and you're interested in opportunities to share what you've found, to share those insights that you've gained, proposals for AERA 2016 and Castle 2016 are fast approaching, typically in August. I think I'll get my fees from AERA and the Castle Conference for the plugs today, but those provide wonderful spaces to keep the conversations going, and those really are the center points of the self-study discourse community and Studying Teacher Education Journal. But thank you once again. Special thanks from me to Déirdre for all the help in getting this set up, and to the keynote speakers again. I don't know where the big red button is to stop this, but I'm going to fade to black off to the side here. So thanks very much, everyone.